Hey everyone, this is the Daily Reader. We're going to start off with The Mature Mind, published in 1948. Switch this thing around. It's by H.A. Overstreet. Suppose that's the author's name, huh? Part 1, The Maturity Concept. Chapter 1, Psychological Foundations. This is the preface. Mankind, wrote Alfred North Whitehead, is now in one of its rare moods of shifting its outlook. The mere compulsion of tradition has lost its force. It is the business of philosophers, students, and practical men to recreate and reenact a vision of the world, conservative and radical, including those elements of reverence and order without which society lapses into a riot, a vision penetrated through and through with unflinching rationality. This book concerns the recreation and reenactment of such a vision through an insight that comes chiefly out of the psychological and psychiatric sciences, and centers in man's mental, emotional, and social maturing. As this new insight penetrates our common consciousness, it helps us to understand the forces that have created our predicaments and brought us close to destruction, and it affords us the clue to our possible advance out of chaos. This insight is what I choose to call the maturity concept. The understanding and living out of this most recent of our psychological and philosophic insights becomes our next obligation and hope. I wish to express my gratitude to numerous fellow scientists and philosophers for help they've given me, help that most of them do not even know they have given. More personally, I wish to thank my wife, Bonaro W. Overstreet, my son, Alan Burr Overstreet, and his wife, Jan, H.A.O. The characteristic knowledge of our century is psychological. Even the most dramatic advances in physics and chemistry are chiefly applications of known methods of research. But the attitude toward human nature and human experience that has come in our time is new. This attitude could not have come earlier. Before it came, there had to be long preparation. Physiology had to be developed. Science for the psychological person is also physiological. His mind, among other things, is a matter of brain tissue, of nerves, of glands, of organs of touch, smell, and sight. It wasn't until about 70 years ago that physiology was sufficiently developed to make psychophysical research possible, as in the laboratories of the distinguished German psychologist William Wundt. But before physiology, there had to be a developed science of biology, since brain, nerves, glands, and the rest all depend upon cell processes. The science of the living cell had to have its maturing before competent physiology could emerge. But before biology, there had to be chemistry, and before chemistry, physics, and before physics, mathematics, so the long preparation goes back into the centuries. There is, in short, a time clock of science. Each science has to wait until its hour strikes. Today, at last, the time clock of science strikes the hour of psychology, and a new enlightenment begins. To be sure, the interests explored by this latest of the sciences are themselves old, but the accuracy of research is new. There is, in brief, a kind of iron logic that is in control. Each science has to wait for its peculiar accuracy until its predecessor has supplied the data and tools out of which its accuracy can be made. Today, this new psychological accuracy is bringing insights that are remaking our life. One insight in particular is of such commanding import that it may be said to be the master concept of our time. This is the concept of psychological maturity. We have known in a way about psychological maturity, but vaguely and intermittently. Its full meaning now begins to dawn upon us. As it begins to dawn, we realize that the maturity concept is central to our whole enterprise of living. This is what our past wisdoms have been leading up to. This, it would seem, is what we must now accept if we are to move forward out of the confusions and despairs of our day. The time clock of science has struck a new hour, and a new insight begins to be at our service. All children, Diderot once observed, are essentially criminal, It is merely our good luck that their physical powers are still too limited to permit them to carry out their destructiveness. Had he lived today, Diderot might have expanded his remark. He might have said that all childish minds are dangerous, but particularly when those minds are housed in adult bodies, for then they have the power to put their immaturities fully and disastrously into effect. The forms that adult childishness can take are almost infinite in number. They exist not merely in those unfortunates who have to be confined to institutions, but in countless thousands of men and women who look adult, are taken to be adult, and are granted the full prerogatives of adulthood. In these grown-up child minds, the immaturities are almost invariably disguised from the individuals themselves. Also, they are usually disguised from those who share their life, largely because these others display similar immaturities themselves. The immaturities, moreover, are disguised from society at large, since that society has as yet developed no constant habit of appraising adult behaviors as immature or mature. Once, however, we begin to understand that these immaturities in adults, we have a clue as to how to bring into our human affairs a greater measure of sanity. The immaturities explain much in our history for which we have hitherto had no sufficient explanation. Similarly, they explain many baffling facts about our present-day behavior, both private and public. They offer us, therefore, a key with which to unlock stubborn problems that have to do with our common welfare and our personal happiness. Also, they provide us with a hope. For these immaturities, fixed as they seem to be in many adults and powerful as they are in many institutions, are themselves subject to change. Something can be done about them. At the least, they can be recognized for what they are and their influence thus lessened. But more than that, the conditions that bring them about and that encourage their continuance can themselves be altered. Both in our private lives and in the social life of our times, we can begin to do a new thing. We can put a premium upon psychological maturity. To put that premium upon adult maturity is our next great concern. Obviously, the maturity concept is not something that has been made out of whole cloth. It is the outgrowth of the major psychological and psychiatric discoveries of our time. Of the laboratories and the clinics, there have come certain insights into our human nature that add up to what we are here calling the maturity concept. These insights are the idea of psychological age, the idea of arrested development or fixation, the idea of conditioned response, the idea of aptitude uniqueness, and the idea of adult capacity to learn. When the significance of these 5 insights is caught and interpreted, they point to one fact, that the proper psychological undertaking of man is to move from immaturity toward maturity. The first of these insights is the idea of psychological age. This idea came into initial use through the efforts of Binet at the turn of the century to measure the mental age of children. What he attempted had never been done before. It had long been recognized, of course, that some children are brighter than others, but there had been no successful attempt to relate brightness or dullness to the age of the child. Through experiments with thousands of children, Binet was able to establish the fact that there are norms of accomplishment for the different ages of childhood. At a certain chronological age, for example, the normal child can be expected to put a square block into a square hole and a round block into a round hole. If at that age a child is still unable to do the expected thing, he is retarded. That is, he is younger in the scale of mental growth than he is on the scale of physical growth. If, on the contrary, he can already do what only older children are normally able to do, he can be rated as above his age, as older in mental terms than in physical. Thus it came to be seen that psychological age need by no means correspond to chronological age. A boy 10 years old by the solar calendar may be only 5 years old by his psychological calendar, or he may be 15. This insight immediately placed a new responsibility upon educators. They can no longer indiscriminately lump children together. A psychological 4-year-old, who is chronologically 10 years of age, cannot possibly keep pace with a class of 10-year-olds. To expect him to do so is arbitrarily to condemn him to failure. Nor could a psychological 15-year-old who was chronologically 10 be safely treated in exactly the same way as those who were more closely fitted the average 10-year-old pattern. Useless provision was made for differences of psychological age. The below-aged child will be driven by despair into apathy or antisocial behaviors. The above-aged child will go nuts with boredom and would in all likelihood emerge from his schooling with more contempt and respect for the ordinary human race of which he was, in the specific area of mental growth, an extraordinary member. Obviously, something new had here been brought to our attention, an insight into our human nature which had once for all made it obligatory that we look at people with new eyes. It was established that every individual has a psychological as well as a chronological age. Since Benet's day, this insight has been so cultivated that the measurement of psychological age has now become standard practice. Too often, however, even where the most conscientious techniques of measurement are employed, the full significance of the concept of psychological age is not grasped. It is understood that here is a means of more effectively classifying children for their schoolwork. It is not always understood that here is an insight that reveals our human nature is possessed of hitherto unsuspected dimensions of complexity. Binet started with the measurement of the mental age of the child, his power to solve problems. Later psychologists extended their exploration into the emotional and social areas of the individual's life. Here, too, was discovered psychological age may differ markedly from chronological. A woman of 30, say, is found to be on the emotional level of the average 15-year-old. Chronologically, she is an adult, but her emotional reactions are still those characteristic of adolescence. Or a boy of 10 is found to have a sense of responsibility and a steadiness of purpose that go normally with 20 years. Chronologically a child, he is emotionally an adult. In like manner, explorations have been made to estimate degrees of social maturity. A man of 25 may have the ego-centered outlook of a typical 5-year-old, or a child of 5 may be far beyond his playmates of his own age, and his power of give and take, his sense of justice, and his spontaneous helpfulness. All of this has provided a new approach to our human selves. The essential thing about an individual, we are being brought to realize, is not so much the number of years he has lived as the psychological competence that those years have netted him. Thus, we are given a new way to estimate ourselves and others. Not all adults are adult. Many who look grown up on the outside may be childish on the inside. Others who look childish on the outside may be surprisingly mature on the inside. Psychological age, moreover, as distinct from chronological, is not merely an academic curiosity. Whether a person is average, advanced, or retarded in his mental, emotional, and social growth may be the concealed reason and the chief reason why his adult relationships with his world are as they are. That we have by no means fully learned the significance of this insight is indicated by the fact that, except in the case of imbeciles and morons, we still admit people to all the major prerogatives of life on a purely chronological basis. The age at which schooling begins and ends is chronological, so is the age at which people may marry without parental consent. So is the age at which they are considered ready for responsible work. So is the age at which they can vote and hold office. After the members of our society have gained enough years to be rated as legally adult, society, except in the most flagrant cases, exercises no control over their daily exhibitions of immaturity. But as we become more fully aware that chronological age does not necessarily betoken a corresponding emotional or social age, we can go seriously at the task of devising ways in which crass immaturity among adults, particularly among those in places of power, may be detected. Up to this date, in human history, we have had no accurate way of estimating the psychological maturity of a congressman, say, or of a judge, or of a superintendent of schools, or of a teacher, or of the head of a corporation. Psychologically, in brief, we have flown blind, precisely because the motives that carry individuals to positions of influence may range all the way from the infantile to the finally mature. We have had power exerted on the adult level by individuals of almost every conceivable psychological age. Side by side in the halls of Congress and college faculty meetings and church and citizens' committees and everywhere else where people congregate, we have had the immature and the mature. The concept of psychological age has only begun to enter our common consciousness. We are generally familiar with its application to children, but we are only beginning to be alert to behavior symptoms in grown men and women that should warn us of their psychological immaturity. That should warn us, for example, against giving them a major chance to set the success standards of our society, or to exert power over other people's lives. Also, we are only now beginning to ask how psychological immaturity can be overcome. We are only beginning, but this new psychological way of regarding ourselves and our human fellows is definitely on the books. When it's also definitely and clearly in our consciousness, we may be set for such a new appraisal of human behaviors as will preface a new society. The second clarifying idea, that of arrested development, or fixation, had its inception in the epoch-making work of Freud. He set out to discover the causes of certain diseases that had baffled medical science for centuries, and that had baffled him in his own medical practice. These diseases presented physical symptoms, yet they stubbornly refused to yield to physical treatment. Paralyses that were not true paralyses, blindness not marked by tissue deterioration, vomitings, tremors, tics, amnesias, deafness, deliriums, phobias, obsessions, compulsions. Working first with hypnosis, then combining it with mental catharsis or talking out, and later discarding hypnosis entirely, Freud probed into the personality depths of his patients, and in a way unprecedented in medical practice. He let his patients talk themselves out, encouraging them to say anything that came into their minds, encouraging them in particular to recover the lost memories of their childhood. Out of this came his epochal discovery that many of the baffling diseases of adulthood had psychic origins and unresolved emotional conflicts of childhood. The key idea was that of unresolved emotional conflict, where a child, he discovered, had undergone some wrenching experience that threatened its basic emotional security, where a child could not, because of its immaturity, understand the experience and take it in its stride, and where, because of some taboo, it was not permitted to talk out its problem with its parents. And there was the likelihood that an inner conflict would remain unresolved. Instead of passing it to the normal life stream and aiding the child in its growth toward maturity, this unnegotiable experience will be repressed into the unconscious. There it would remain fixated as a deep sense of guilt or incompetence, and from there it would operate as the source of later emotional disturbances. Freud's method of cure was to get the patient, through a prolonged and seemingly irrelevant process of talking out his life, to revive the memory of this repressed and long-forgotten shock experience. When the revival finally did take place, when a child's unnegotiable experience was at last placed within the context of adult understanding, the conflict was resolved and the patient cured. A vast amount of controversy has ensued since Freud left his first neurotic patients to talk themselves out. Freud himself built out of the revelations brought forth by a simple but amazingly effective technique, a whole system of psychology that has been variously attacked and defended, accepted in total by some psychiatrists and greatly modified by others. We are not interested to hear in Freudianism as a total system, but rather in a single Freudian insight that seems to be unassailable, and that profoundly illumines the problem of man's maturing. This is the insight that whenever in the formative years of life an intense emotional conflict is left unresolved, it does not disappear but remains as a festering element that later takes the form of a severe emotional disturbance or of a pervasive uneasiness in the handling of life. What this insight comes to in its simplicity is that a human being does not grow beyond a problem that has deep emotional significance for him until he comes to terms with that problem, until he understands it, accommodates it in his life arrangements, if possible, resolves it entirely. Instead of growing beyond such an unresolved problem and of growing beyond its power to hurt, the individual becomes fixated at the point of development where he encountered the problem. A neurosis in adulthood is a sign that at some certain point in the formative years of life, development was thus arrested. A shock experience that should properly have been assimilated and outlived was instead repressed into the unconscious, where it continued to operate in its infantile form. The adult, in brief, is neurotic, because he is continuing to seek in infantile ways a solution to a problem that overpowered him in infancy. Thus, a neurosis is an ungrown-up way of trying to solve a conflict that can only be solved by the adult in a grown-up way. Not all immature adults are neurotic, But where there is adult immaturity, the same pattern of arrested development or fixation is likely to show up as the root cause for the halting of the maturing process. Mental, emotional, and social immaturity in an adult is not, in short, an inexplicable mystery, not since Freud. Such immaturity indicates that the adult is still trying to work out by childish means the problem of his various relationships to life. We may illustrate by a familiar example. Early in life, a child may learn that he can get what he wants by making a nuisance of himself. If he will scream loudly enough, kick his heels, hold his breath, choke, or red in the face, he can frighten the life out of his parents and make them yield. It does not take a child long to become wise to this way of solving this problem. They have a conflict of desires between himself and his parents. A mature solution of such a conflict would involve a mutual talking out of the situation and the reaching of an agreement. This clearly is as yet impossible to the child, so he seeks to get what he wants by the only means that seem within his command, and that get results. If the child has wise parents, he may be helped to outgrow this infantile way of attacking a problem. They may be able in their wisdom to perform the double act of refusing to yield to his methods of persuasion, and yet of giving him so deep a sense of their love and dependability that he can risk reliance upon their care and can gradually mature his methods of satisfying his wants. If the child has unwise parents who time after time give in to him, or who, by their own erratic moods, keep him insecure, his infantile way of going at problems may well become fixed in him, and he may be thus arrested in his proper development toward mature problem solving. Should this happen, he may be found at 40, say, as a man who still gets his own way by having tantrums, browbeating his wife, terrifying his children, bawling out his subordinates. If he happens to be in politics, instead of trying to explore political issues to their rational depths, he may simply wear down his opponents by a method equivalent to the childish method of screaming and kicking his heels. A comparable, though quite different case of arrested development is that of the adult practical joker. Somewhere along the line, this individual found that he could get importance or significance for himself by making someone else look foolish, and he made that discovery at so early an age that he did not yet have the kind of social imagination that will make him feel keenly the other person's hurt. Having achieved success in attention-getting through the use of a pre-adult method, he clings to that method so that at 40 he wears a squirt bulb flower in his lapel, hands out firecracker cigars, rigs up a friend's car so that a small torpedo will explode when the car is started, and rips up hotel furniture during a Legion convention. Punching and bald, and with the laugh of vacuous triumph, he remains to the end of his days the small boy who has never grown up. And this insight into the causes of arrested development or fixation is of prime importance to our understanding of maturity. In the first place, it focuses our attention upon the formative years of life. Survival is a child's first need. A sense of his own significance is the second. The child from birth needs to feel secure, needs to be noticed, needs to be wanted. These deep, inescapable needs are frequently not satisfied. In all kinds of ways, the child may be made to feel that he amounts to nothing, that he is a nuisance, a drag, a failure, an unwanted member of the family. No child can stand that. Thus, slapped down, he has to find some way to win attention and significance. If he were mature, he could attack his problem by developing a competence and by establishing personal relationships with people outside his own family. But he is immature. That is, he is helpless, either to understand this problem or to solve it by rational means. Thus, he does the only thing he can do. He tries to resolve it by the means at his command, and these, by the nature of things, are immature means. He may get what he wants by aggressiveness, if his trials in that direction bring him success, or he may retreat into fantasy, building the habit of seeing himself a hero in every situation, and of seeing other people as incapable of appreciating him, or he may become outwardly submissive, at the same time developing unconscious hostilities that he cannot acknowledge even to himself. Gearing his life to such immature methods of problem solving, he unwittingly halts his own growth toward emotional and social maturity. An insight that thus focuses attention upon the formative years can mean much for the advance of our civilization. If a fine maturity is rare among adults, one chief reason we begin to see lies in our hitherto widespread ignorance of the 1,001 ways in which the maturing process can be checked in the early years of life. If we want a greater maturity among the adults of the future, the years of infancy and childhood and the emotional problems that mark those years deserve every wise attention they can be given. A second importance of this insight is that it helps us to discriminate, where the behavior of grown-ups is concerned, between what is genuinely mature and what is infantile. We begin to add a new keenness to our social intelligence as we learn to ask the question, is this man or woman solving his problems in an adult or in an infantile manner? A third importance follows. We begin to look about for ways in which to reestablish the growth processes of such undeveloped adults, where we see grown-ups missing out on the rich experience of maturity, or we see them creating fear and misery for others. We can no longer be satisfied to say, oh, he's only a grown-up boy, or she's really a little girl at heart, knowing that little boys and girls who have adult bodies and adult power can do vast mischief, in a world that desperately needs maturity. We begin to ask how these oversized little ones can be encouraged to act their age. We begin to ask, moreover, what family practices, classroom practices, and various cultural practices have thus far discouraged their acting their age. And this insight into arrested development or fixation, in short, makes us take a new look at the whole process of human growth, from birth to death, through infancy, childhood, adolescence, adulthood. It makes us aware of fateful years of life and the fateful experiences. It induces in us a new seriousness about how life should develop. In the early 1900s, a Russian physiologist, Ivan Pavlov, performed an experiment on a dog. It looked like a simple routine experiment, the kind that thousands of physiologists perform every day. But this experiment was not routine in its consequences, it was seminal. Out of it came a new comprehension of what makes us become the creatures we are, and of what can make us become very different creatures. The experiment of the dog, the meat, and the bell is too well known now to require retelling. The point of it lay in what Pavlov discovered about the manner in which artificial stimuli can become incorporated into our natural makeup. To salivate when meat is brought is natural to a dog, but no one a priori would suppose that a dog would salivate because a bell was rung. Yet by ringing a bell every time the meat was brought, Pavlov was able so to condition dog nature that salivation took place merely at the ringing of the bell without the presence of meat. Out of this and succeeding experiments, the idea of the conditioned response entered the thinking of our century. And it's become one more of the major ideas out of which our maturity concept can be shaped. One thing it has shown us is that man's nature, like the dog's nature, is not something fixed and unalterable. Amazing things can be done to make it different from its natural self. In all the centuries of canine life, there had never been a dog that had spontaneously salivated at the ringing of a bell. For the ringing of a bell has nothing to do with the physiological process of salivation. Yet by a few repetitions of bell and meat together, a certain dog in the early 1900s was turned into a hitherto unknown kind of creature. Where hitherto he, like all his canine fellows, had been only meat responding, he was now turned into a unique being. A dog that was bell responding. What was found to be true of the dog was easily shown to be true of man. Man, in innumerable ways, can be conditioned to be a creature that he is not by his original nature. He is not by his original nature, for example, a creature who spontaneously stops his forward movement when a red light appears, yet, as we know, he can be made into that kind of creature. Similarly, he can be conditioned to eat spinach and like it, to kill his fellow men and feel proud of it, to insult a minority race and feel justified in his discourtesy. In each case, the result is accomplished by the meat and bell process. The eating of spinach wins him approving smiles. The killing of fellow men is accompanied by citations, medals, the cheers of the multitude. The discourtesy to a minority race is lauded as a solicitude for race purity. In each case, an artificial stimulus is so closely tied up with the satisfaction of a basic need for food, safety, approval, a sense of belonging, that a response to the stimulus is felt as natural. Within limits, in brief, the human being can become almost anything that is conceived as desirable by those who set up the stimuli to which he responds. We cannot make man into an airplane, but we can make him into an airplane maker. We cannot make him into an atomic bomb, but we can make him into a creature who feels it necessary to make and use an atomic bomb. Within the limits of our human nature reside almost limitless possibilities. What we have thus far made of ourselves during all of the millennia of our history on Earth is only a preliminary to what we make of ourselves. Apply the proper stimuli, and the old Adam can be turned into the new Adam. This is the rousing news brought to us by Pavlov's experiment on conditioned response. It is news, however, that cuts both ways. By effective stimuli, we can build far more enlightened and capable human beings, but by equally effective stimuli, we can build creatures in whom human powers are dangerously distorted. In the schools that Hitler designed for German youth, for example, the meat and bell technique conditioned a whole generation of boys and girls to contempt for non-Aryans, to cruelty to Jews, to spying upon parents and neighbors, to unquestioning obedience to the Führer. And the Nazi youth, male and female, who poured like a scourge over Europe, have been conditioned into creatures unrecognizable as human by common standards of human decency. This is one in which conditioning can work, and it's a way that we are learning to worry about. All through our human society and families, schools, communities, nations, a vast amount of conditioning is taking place that is inimical to maturity, that is inimical even to human survival. In the modern world, for example, most of the Earth's inhabitants have been conditioned to the concept of nationalism. A man may be a man for that, but first of all, he is an American, a Russian, a German. We might more properly say, in the light of Pavlov's experiment, that modern man was born human, but that by a complex, reiterated meat and bell technique, he has been made into an American, a Russian, a German. That is to say, he has been brought to the point where he spontaneously associates the satisfaction of his own needs with the strength and permanence of his own nation. The experience of belonging to that nation is, in fact, of such psychic importance to him that he will seek to preserve it even at the risk of his life. One of the most interesting psychological events of our time is that a new meat and bell setup is beginning to challenge the old. Little by little, through the presence of new stimulating facts, man is being persuaded to bring into spontaneous association the satisfaction of his own needs and the idea of one world. That is, his natural need to belong is being related to a different object, not the tribe or the nation, but a united mankind. And this new conditioned linkage is firmly established, so that the average individual is as deeply moved by feeling himself a citizen of the world as he has long been moved by feeling himself a citizen of a nation. The change will have taken place by a process that Pavlov made familiar. The difference between provincial man and cosmopolitan man will be, in a sense, analogous to the difference between the meat-responding dog and the bell-responding dog. Happily, however, the difference will be of greater moment than the mere statement of that analogy will imply. Cosmopolitan man will, in contrast to provincial man, be man with a greater chance to mature, man with a larger area in which he can exercise his faculty for fairness and reasonableness, without coming up against fixed loyalty barriers that bid him stop. We shall have more to say later about the types of political arrangement that make for immaturity and for maturity. Here it's sufficient to say that Pavlov, when he introduced his insight regarding conditioned responses, gave us one more clue, both as to why many people grow to adulthood without becoming psychologically mature, and as to how we can begin to work for the further maturing of our human race. Maturity is achieved where conditions favorable to maturity exist. That is the clue. A fourth seminal insight of modern psychology is the idea of individual uniqueness. In one sense, of course, this is not a new insight. All our great social and philosophical thinkers have been keenly aware of the fact of individual differences. It remained, however, for psychologists to give us the insight scientific precision. As far back as 1885, the psychologist Carl Stumpf began work on tests of musical talent. Since that time, other psychologists, Horovic's, Roop, Seashore, Laurie, Shern, Qualwasser, Decana, Drake, Ortman, and others have tried to isolate this particular uniqueness in individuals and measure its strength. Clearly, with respect to musical talent, all individuals were by no means alike. Some appeared to have no musical aptitude whatever, others were highly endowed with power to appreciate musical tones and rhythms and to create in their forms. The test of musical ability was only the beginning. Soon it was seen that there was another specific aptitude in which individuals differed, namely mechanical aptitude. Researches to isolate and measure this particular talent were begun. As a result, numerous tests have been devised to distinguish the mechanical genius from the mechanical dud. In like manner, clerical aptitudes have been isolated and measured with a fair amount of success. Attempts have also been made, though with less success so far, to measure medical and artistic aptitudes. What all this adds up to is more than just a working body of information about this and that skill. It adds up to a basic recognition of one important factor in the maturing of the individual. If each individual has a certain uniqueness of power, his maturing will best be accomplished along the line of that power. To try to develop him along lines that go in directions contrary to that of his major strength is to condition him to defeat. Thus, the non-mechanical person who is arbitrarily thrust into a mechanical occupation cannot help but do his work poorly and reluctantly, with some deep part of himself in conscious or unconscious rebellion. He may blame himself for the low level of his accomplishment or for his persistent discontent, but not all his self-berating, nor even all his efforts to become more competent by further training, can make up for the original aptitude lack. Unless he discovers this aptitude lack, he may be doomed to a lifetime of self-blame, with a consequent loss of self-confidence and the halting of his psychological growth. Or he may take refuge in self-pity, finding reason to believe that his failure is due to one or another bad break, to the jealousy of a superior, to lack of sympathy and help at home, to an initial bad start, to a lack of appreciation of what he does. If he thus goes the way of self-pity, he is doomed to a lifetime of self-commiseration that makes sound growth impossible. Or he may go to the way of general hostility without ever tracing this hostility to its source in his work life. If he is, for example, one of those unhappy modern workers who have come to accept their daily labor as a source of income only, and who do not expect it to yield satisfaction in its own right, it may never occur to him that there is a relationship between his quick angers and fixed prejudices on the one hand, and this misplacement in work on the other. Yet this misplacement may be the most distorting factor in his experience, and the most inescapably distorting, since it is with him every day. Once the idea becomes central in our culture that a man is at his best when he is doing his best, at what he can do best, many of the present hindrances to a sound maturing will be removed. To mature is to bring one's powers to realization. To waste those powers or to force individuals to try to exhibit powers they do not possess is to defeat the maturing impulse of life. This point of view about aptitude is of special importance to the schools. In the main, schools have been a kind of aptitude melting pot. All the different special strengths of individual students have been thrown in together and melted down into an undifferentiated mass. With this new insight, however, and the tests that now support it, the years of schooling from nursery school to adult education can become years not of flattening out the individual into the average, but of building him up into the uniqueness of his own powers. As more and more members of our society are thus built up, we will have as a cultural asset more and more people who enjoy the processes that lead to maturity and who begin to glimpse the fact that the movement toward maturity is the movement toward happiness. The characteristic of the mature person is that he affirms life. To affirm life, he must be involved, heart and soul, in the process of living. Neither the person who feels himself a failure nor the person who consciously or unconsciously resents what life has done to him can feel his heart and soul engaged in the process of living. That experience is reserved for the person whose full powers are enlisted. This, then, is what this fourth insight signifies. To mature, the individual must know what his powers are and must make them competent for life. Know thyself, said Socrates. Know your aptitudes, say these modern Socratics. In 1928, Edward Thorndike published a book, Adult Learning, which reversed the long-established assumption, namely that childhood is a time of learning, that adulthood is a time of having learned. Because of this ancient assumption, the educational energies of the American people have been largely expended on the building of public schools for children and young people. The hope was that if all the young of America could be educated, the destinies of a democratic nation would be made secure. Where the young were not properly schooled, they were commonly taken to be lost so far as their education was concerned. Adult minds were too old and stiff to be learning minds. The accepted pronouncement was that you can't teach an old dog new tricks. The establishment of adult education in America did not wait upon psychological research. Here, as in every other field, there were individuals of creative insight who saw in human nature much that was concealed from the average view. Even before Thorndike conducted his investigations and published his book, many pioneering ventures had grown up to independent strength and have federated into an American adult education movement. But again, it was the psychologist who gave the scientific basis for what had already been done by trial and error. And it was the psychologist who so set forth facts regarding the how and why of adult learning that those facts could become naturalized in the common mind. Based on an exhaustive examination of such psychological data and on various specifically devised experiments with adult groups, Thorndike's book announced as its established conclusion the fact that adults can learn. In general, nobody under 45 should restrain himself from trying to learn anything because of a belief or fear that he is too old to be able to learn, nor should he use that fear as an excuse for not learning anything which he ought to learn. If he fails in learning it, inability due directly to age will very rarely, if ever, be the reason. The actual reason why adults do not see themselves as learners, he pointed out, is that factors either within themselves or within their culture place certain obstacles in the way. The factors within themselves may be various: a lack of aptitude for learning the particular subject undertaken, a desire too weak to establish proper attention habits where the habits are absent, ignorance of how to set about learning, habits, ideas, or emotional tendency that block the learning experience. Obstacles within the culture arise from the unusualness of adult study, from the fact that the enterprise of organized learning lies outside the accustomed pattern of adult life. There is the possibility of ridicule, of being made conspicuous by going to school, when grown-ups are supposed to be through with school, of loneliness, an experience that was a companionable one during the years of childhood, of being thought inferior or stupid by seeming to need to study at an age when study is presumed to have been accomplished. It is, Thorndike established once and for all, factors like these, personal and cultural, that discourage adult learning. It is not adulthood itself. For people who had placidly accepted the immaturity of non-learning, this was a sharp alert. If adults did not learn, it was not the fault of nature. To justify the dying back of their brains by the fact that they were grown men and women would no longer do. Where there was aliveness of interest and purpose, growing old might mean growing wiser in mind and character, and it might also mean growing more informed in matters relating to personal and common welfare. As other psychologists and educators have carried further what Thorndike began, it has become increasingly apparent not only that adults can learn, but that it is a threat to our whole society to have them stop learning, to have them become fixed and an unhappy or a complacent unchangeability in the world where they are constantly confronted by the problem of change. This is an age of rapid evolution and sometimes revolution in politics and economics as well as technology. Facts and ideas that were right yesterday may be wrong or completely irrelevant today. An adult who ceases, after youth, to unlearn and relearn his facts and to reconsider his opinions is like a blindfolded person walking into a familiar room where someone has moved the furniture. Furthermore, he is a menace to a democratic community. One of the consequences of a rapidly changing world is that there is a much more important job for adult education than ever before. In fact, adult education in these days should rank in importance with elementary, secondary, and college education. Here, then, is a fifth psychological contribution to the maturity concept. Whether or not old dogs can learn new tricks, old human beings can and must learn new facts and insights as long as they live. Since the beginning of the modern age, the chief method of science has been that of dividing to conquer. By this method, it has put at our disposal a well-nigh incredible body of facts, regarding everything from the behavior of the atom to the behavior of the human mind confronted by a problem. We have amassed, as it were, an enormous stockpile of classified information. Now apparently science is ready for a new method, that of uniting to conquer. What has been divided and subdivided for purposes of research is now being reassembled for purposes of interpretation and of application to human affairs. Even the newspapers have recognized it as news when atomic scientists, sociologists, and psychologists sit down together to try to fuse their separate brands of knowledge into wisdom about the future of man. Not less newsworthy, though, it has not yet made the headlines, is the fact that within the separate disciplines, a like process of reintegration is underway. Within the field of psychology, for example, the fragmented human being, fragmented for purposes of minute and accurate research, is being once more made whole. Explorations that have long seemed to lead in different directions are converging and taking a common road. The maturity concept is one product of this new process of integration and synthesis. In it are brought together for a mutual elimination and pooled strength the chief insights into human nature and behavior that have thus far been contributed by psychological and psychiatric science. Insights that have hitherto stood for the most part in mutual isolation